Hello, good evening and welcome to this Operational Excellence Society webinar. I am Benjamin Taylor. I think you'll be able to see me on your screens now. I'm waving and I'm wearing my ridiculous noise cancelling flight headset to try to reduce any interference on the call. I will switch off the video now for the duration of the call. I'll introduce the webinar and the Operational Excellence Society for those who are not familiar. I'll go through the content as quickly as I can. Feel free to raise a hand if you have a question to ask. I'm a bit of a novice with this equipment and doing these webinars live through this mechanism. So I can't guarantee I'll see everything, but I will stop at the end and take comments. I'll review the webinar chat for any questions that have appeared there. And hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion if you can stick around that long. As you'll see from the screen, this is an Operational Excellence Society webinar, and you can see this charming chap in the small blue box, Joseph Paris. Joseph is not on the call despite appearances, so you may see him as a panelist. That's Charles Ottman, the technical support person for the Operational Excellence Society. Joe introduced me to the Operational Excellence Society, and I'll just say a little bit about its origins and where it's got to now, and so on, before we go into the meat of the webinar. This is sponsored by Joe's organisation Zonitech and the Readiness Institute, which is online blended learning to support operational excellence. I'll just move on to explain that the subject of this webinar is Leading in Tough Times, the Role of Systems Thinking. My name is Benjamin Taylor. I'm the managing partner of RedQuadrant and a few more roles besides, which I'll explain in a bit more detail later. Our definition at the Operational Excellence Society is that we believe that operational excellence is a state of readiness attained as the efforts throughout the enterprise reach a state of alignment for pursuing its strategies, where the corporate culture is committed to the continuous and deliberate improvement of company performance and the circumstances of those who work there, and is a precursor to becoming a high-performance organisation. And Charles has just notified me that you can use the Q&A button to queue up questions. I think that's you rather than me. If you have a question, hit the Q&A button. So just moving on, the Operational Excellence Society started as a very small LinkedIn group set up by Joseph Paris into a much larger group, which now has over 680,000 members, growing by 250 per month. It's the largest group by far on LinkedIn dedicated to the subject and discipline of operational excellence. And if you're not a member, come join. Just look for operational excellence in your LinkedIn groups. We eventually left cyberspace to become face-to-face, founded the Operational Excellence Society. So we're a think tank, a creator and aggregator of knowledge, know-how and wisdom. We're open to the public, no membership or fees. We're naturally curious, critical thinkers, or at least we like to think we are. And we're definitely multicultural, as you'll see from the attendees even here today, with an international audience. What we do is we strive to improve company performance and the circumstances of those who work in the companies, promote principles of operational excellence, exchange ideas, knowledge and experiences, and provide mentors to those wanting to learn and connectors of people who need with people who have. And I am privileged to be one of the advisory board members for the OPEX Society. The website of the Operational Excellence Society, opexsociety.org, provides further information. Do go and have a look there. You'll find the body of knowledge with over 1,200 pieces of informative articles and other content. A bookstore, so you can build your own personal library of books recommended by the Society by genre. An events calendar, roster of members of the advisory board and sponsors, and lots of other useful information. So I'm just going to reiterate a few things. All the lines are hopefully now muted during the webinar. I will answer questions at the end. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to queue up questions for me. After the webinar, everybody who's registered will receive the link to this recording within a day. So bear in mind everything you say, if you are unmuted later, will be recorded. I'll deal with any unanswered questions that I've missed after the webinar by email or other appropriate mechanisms. We will launch a discussion in the OPEX Society LinkedIn group following on from the webinar. So, time for us to dive in. My topic is leading in tough times and the role of systems thinking. One of my absolute obsessions is systems thinking in the broadest sense of the word. And so I'll just introduce myself, but I will say that all of this work is perpetual work in progress, and I'm constantly reiterating and revising it based on my organization's on the ground work with clients as we find different ways to communicate, we learn lessons, etc., etc. Excuse me. I am very happy to connect with all of you on LinkedIn. I'm known as Ant the Boy on LinkedIn and Twitter and other social media. I should say, if it sounds a little bit unprofessional, Ant the Boy is not some strange public school hunting accident. That's my standard line. It's an anagram of the shorter version of my name, although I prefer to be called Benjamin Taylor these days. If you call Benjamin or Ben Taylor, it's very hard to get your username on social media. So Ant the Boy is actually just an anagram of the short version of my name. And it's stuck ever since. I run RedQuadrant, a public service consultancy in the UK and around the world. I'm a board member of the Systems and Complexity in Organisation, now an international charity with a base in the UK. As I say, I'm an advisory board member of the OPEX Society, and I run a not-for-profit social enterprise called the Public Service Transformation Academy, which occasionally does work internationally as well. So you'll get an impression, I have worked in all kinds of industries, but I have a fairly strong base in the complexity and austerity these days, especially in the UK, of public services. And that's going to come through probably in portions of these slides, but I believe that these approaches are appropriate for all sectors. You'll judge that for yourselves. So forgive me the swearing, which I've bleeped out for the taste of any of our international audience, but there is a lot of bullshit out there. Lots of stuff that's talked about leadership is bullshit. Lots of stuff that's talked about operational excellence is bullshit. And I don't know about you, but I come across many, many clients who've been through, quotes, transformation after transformation, and have found that nothing has really changed apart from who they report to, maybe the organizational structure and a new IT system. So most of it is not really transformational. Not everything, fortunately, is marketing and spin. And I want you to hold me to these standards during the course of this webinar. I believe that things which are good, things that are useful, have a theory of how the world works, a method of intervention that allows you to predict how your intervention will make a difference, and have lots and lots of rich case studies of having been tried and failed, which is where we get the really rich learning from. And for, I think, any of the slides in this webinar, I can provide all of those. So having said that, I've set a high standard for myself. What I will be able to do today is give you a skim over the surface of the complete method that we use. Obviously, there's a subtle element of marketing this. I'd love people to come to me and my company for work, but this is not an advert. And I'm very, very happy to follow up with any questions you may have after the webinar. If you think, I think that that model that Benjamin talked about might apply, I'm very happy for you to contact me via social media or by email. I'll respond as quickly and in as much depth as I'm able. So there are world-changing ideas in this content. I'm going to cover an awful lot. What I want you to do is listen critically, apply these ideas, and just find one idea out of what I cover today that you really like, that you can build on, come up with questions. I'll be happy to address them. So I'll start off by talking about VUCA, because VUCA is a very popular concept these days, particularly when people start to talk about troubled times and turbulence and so on. And I'll introduce my core concept of the 5 worlds of operational excellence. VUCA, for those who don't know, stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's a term originating in the US military, and I think it's just a slightly dangerous turn of phrase. Why do I think that? Because actually we entered the Second World War with biplanes, with propellers. We ended it with jet fighters. There has never been a time when people haven't said the pace of change is relentless and ever increasing. It may be true, but it's banal to actually say we're living in more complex and volatile times. So I think that this is an old narrative. Rafael Ramirez at Oxford Said Business School talks about tuna, which is a little bit more approachable, which stands for turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous. In a sense, I think all of these things do apply. I'm more concerned with how do you maintain a systems approach to managing the whole enterprise for operational excellence in times of stress and adversity. I'm not sure if there's going to be some strange animation in the slides here. No, here we are. We entered the Second World War, as I said before, with prop biplanes. We ended it with jet fighters, just to demonstrate the speed of progress has always been something that's concerned managers and leaders. So we've developed this 5 worlds approach. And the point about this little, very, very simple model, and you can pay less attention to the content of each of the boxes and just think about the 5 boxes in their own right, in a sense, is that we talk about there being these 5 worlds in organization. So there's customer world, where we all live our lives. There's service world, where we actually deliver products, outcomes, services, support to our customers. And it really is only at the boundary of the organization, at the boundary between customer world and service world, that we're actually generating the real value of the organization. Then we have management world, which I take it as principally concerned with integration of the whole system, design and redesign of the organization. Leadership world, which I take it as principally concerned with the shared understanding of organizational purpose and measures and intentionally shaping the culture. Both of those are concerned with clarity of boundaries and discretion. I'm less occupied than most people, perhaps, by trying to make a clear distinction between management and leadership. I think that's mostly done only for rhetorical purposes, so I don't think it really matters. Most managers in organizations need to be leaders. Most leaders are also managers. What I would say is that the world that's usually neglected is the top left, which we call the world of learning and change and looking to the future. And it's actually in thinking about how these 5 worlds map onto any part of your organizational system. So this could be the whole worldwide enterprise, or it could be a single operating unit, that the value comes. And what I encourage people to really focus on, and we work in our work in looking at, is the relationships between the different worlds, how they are interacting, and are they all regularly linking into the world of learning, improvement, and change in the top left there. Very often, in our experience, they're not. Very often, this little approach, which contains within it the underlying concepts of the viable systems model from Stafford Beer, can easily help you to just look at a system, a part of a system, a part of the organization, and try to identify where the strengths and where the weaknesses are. So how does this apply in turbulent times? And there are some things I'm going to be able to cover today, and some things which I won't be able to get into, certainly in any depth. In customer world, we say always start with the customer. And in troubled times, you need to focus more than ever on moving up the value chain from meeting demand to meeting customer need and purpose. And I'll explain that. We won't be able to get into our customer strategy thinking around insight, segmentation, demand analysis, sense and respond, and the critical problem of why your measures lead you astray. I'm sorry, not time for that. In service world, I'll show you our core 7 ways to save and improve model to help balance short-term programmatic improvements that you probably need in the immediate crisis of turbulent times with more transformational, emergent, longer-term, unpredictable change. In leadership and management world, I'll emphasize the importance of relationships and of role and task and decision-making clarity so that people can actually be free to use their discretion, not frozen by fear in organizational life, which is a huge theme that I find with my clients as they come under more and more pressure, so that you can allow people to use their discretion to help the organization to adapt to complexity, not treat everything as a long-term strategic decision-making requirement. I won't be able to get into the critical issue of culture shaping and what we call the dark matter of organizational life. I may give you a little flavor of those, but there's no time in this short session. In the world of learning and change, in turbulent times, you need to accelerate change and learning and strategic thinking, because the huge risk is that you get drawn into a short-term focus, which leads you to sleepwalk into reducing your strategic options and ultimately disaster. We won't be able to get into any of our tools in that space around the pre-mortem and the sense and respond model, but I'm happy to follow up with any questions if any of those things seem particularly relevant to you. I've mentioned once or twice now what we call the dark matter of organizational life. This really is core to systems thinking, which I take, broadly speaking, to be about seeing underlying patterns of how things seem to work in the organization and in the world. I don't believe that are systems in the world. It's about how we understand and interpret things. But this concept of dark matter, so the dark matter is the thing that we're not completely sure about, but in theoretical physics and increasingly in experimental findings, we're discovering that there is this invisible, unseen matter in the universe that has a gravitational effect that is holding the universe together. So dark matter is a metaphor that I took from Hoverstadt and Lowe, a book, excellent book, Patterns of Strategy, which is basically what is there in each organization that is pulling things around, that is making having an impact that you can't necessarily see, that's below the surface. You might like to think of it as how to avoid the icebergs. So one is that your organization has a de facto purpose, which is not the purpose that you think it is, which is being driven by your management measures and your management approaches. I just leave that there. The viable systems model illustrates the hidden underlying organizational logic of organizational life. I'll hint at that today, but not get into it. As leaders, you're constantly shaping your culture. Every single time you act or your people experience an organizational system or an instance of organizational symbolism, they have an emotional response to that. Depending how their core gut emotional reaction comes in when they experience leadership, systems, and symbolism, they'll generate a more or less productive, enabled culture. Power and Systems, the great work of a guy called Barry Oshry, which I very much encourage you to look into, demonstrates how natural human dynamics eat partnership for breakfast. As soon as you have tops, middles, bottoms, and customers in any transaction, in any part of the organization, there are things which they naturally assume are their job and their way of working in the world, which pull them out of partnership. Similarly, as soon as you have a dominant and an outside culture, you generate systems fragility, because the ways in which we naturally respond to those themes of dominance and outsider throw us out of cultural robustness, out of partnership. Structural coupling, 90% or more of organizational strategies seem to fail. Why is that? It's mostly because of this dark matter, which is the core concept in the Hoverstadt and Lowe book, that we are being pulled into a closer and closer partnership with our environment. Just to give you an example of that, RedQuadrant is mostly a public services consultancy, so it more and more has to recruit people, adopt IT security practices, get good at bidding for government work, etc., which, whether we like it or not, and most of the time it's unseen, restrict and control our strategic options, because we get naturally, and it's the logical thing to do every single step of the way, but do you like the path it's leading us down, more and more embedded in government work. The final dark matter of organizational life, which is truly the dark matter of human life, is trauma, shame, and referred pain. A lot of things that happen in organizations can be explained by people's desire to avoid exposing their emotional self, their core, their feelings, their hurt, their shame, etc. And certainly in the organizations I work with, but in lots of organizations where there is trouble, where there's been turbulence, where times are tough, there's a lot of shame, and a lot of people have gone through the trauma of working for years on a project. The plug gets pulled, and for political reasons or because of a non-disclosure agreement around somebody's exit agreement, nobody can talk about it. And the pain of that can freeze and control organizations for quite some time. So let me pull you back a little bit to think about the five worlds model. And you might ask the question, why do I describe them as different worlds? Well, that's the question I'm asking, and I've got control of the microphone. So this manga from, I think, the 16th century is of a very ancient tale that certainly goes across most of the Far East, which is the blind men describing an elephant. I apologize if anybody's offended by the disableist term, but it's a fairly good metaphor. Concept is that there are these blind men going out for a walk, 2, 4, 6, 8. Here, I think there's about 10. The number varies. But each of them is trying to describe this elephant. We can take the elephant as a metaphor for organizational life. And you can see that the person at the front here is at the sharp, pointy end of the elephant. He says the elephant is very much like a spear. It's sharp and dangerous and pointy. Somebody here says an organization is very much like a brick wall. It's very, very solid, very hard. However much you push, it's not going to move out of your way. Somebody here says that an elephant, that's at the tail end, I'm not sure if you can see my annotations, says that an elephant is very much like snakes or vines or ropes. And actually, elephants smell really, really bad. So this is used often as a metaphor in personal development. You've probably seen it before. And the cheap version of the metaphor, in my mind, the less deep version, says if only we could put all of our perspectives together, if we could add up all the bits that we see of the elephants, then we would see the whole thing. And the problem is that's just not true, unfortunately. Because in each of these worlds, in the sharp, pointy, dangerous, in the immobile, brick wall-like part of the elephant, in the stinky, pooey end of the elephant, the experience is so fundamentally different. The way people make sense of the world is fundamentally different. So they can never truly communicate. You can visit the other worlds, you can try and communicate a bit better, but ultimately these worlds are completely separate. So how can we, as operational excellence practitioners, particularly in times of strife, when the sharp, pointy end gets more sharp and pointy, and the immobile end gets more immobile, and the smelly end gets more smelly, how can we interact with these separate worlds? You know, everything we send down to the guy at the sharp, pointy end is going to be another threat, another sharp, pointy, dangerous thing. Everything we send to the guy at the tail end is just going to be more elephant dung. Let me bring it into real life. Now, how do I get rid of those bits of annotation? That'll be fun. Eraser. Good. Okay. Oh, that's good. And so in the real life organization, we have customer world. In customer world, we don't think about it. We just go about our business. We have our wants and needs. Then we have service world. Service world is where we have to operate pragmatically because we have to deal with all the complexity of all the demands and challenges coming in from the customers, and everybody who's been in operations knows what that's like. And we have this invisible boundary between custom world and service world over which no information can travel unscathed. We actually give it a military metaphor. We often call it the front line. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but this concept that it's almost like the people in service world are in the trenches defending against this oncoming onslaught of enemies from customer world. And sometimes it really does feel like that. There's too much demand, there's too much requirements. They're ever demanding customers and we just can't meet their needs. The 2 points I have to make here are, first of all, that where we go wrong is there's a very strong systems thinking principle called transduction that explains why when the customer comes to the front line and tells us what they want, we can't actually really listen to that and make sense of it and bring it into service world. There's a systems boundary here at the front line. So the way I explain it is we have customers A, B, and C. They have A, B, and C shaped requirements, and we have to fit them into our predetermined services. So customer A, we put into the triangle shaped service because that broadly fits. Customer B, we don't know anything about what they require, so we ignore them, and the customer never actually gets their request through to the organization. The organization never knows that we've turned away a customer B. Customer C, we say, well, that looks like the circle-shaped requirements for me. So we from customers A, B, and C, we end up providing services or products triangle and circle-shaped. They don't actually meet the requirements. Customer B then goes away. They might go to a competitor and undermine our market. They might learn to disguise themselves and come back looking like a C, so they get the circle service, so they at least get something. Or they might go around, go to the boss, go to social media, go to the press, complain about what they haven't received. So that adds complexity and turbulence to our world, which in troubled times we can ill afford. Customers A and C, because they're not getting exactly the service that's customer shaped, add complexity and workarounds and extra requirements here in service world, which adds more requirements on managers to manage it. That's the first point. Information never crosses a boundary between worlds unscathed. It gets badly translated from one to the other. Then the second point is, actually, this is the point of power. If only we could actually listen to the customers and really make sense of what they want and provide it, we would be ahead of 99.9% of all organizations in any industry anywhere in the world. So one of the big questions for operational excellence, and this is in lean voice of the customer, it's in jobs to be done, it's in agile, is how do we actually listen to our customers' real requirements without translating them into service world language. So many ways we can do that. There are many ways we can do that wrong. Then we have management world. And if I said service world operates by a logic of pragmatism, then management world operates by a logic of rationalism. Because if you're not rational and logical as a manager, then really, what are you? You're not doing a very good job as a manager if you're not demonstrating that you're rational. So they speak these different languages, and it's very hard to translate between them. And slightly jokingly, I say that the invisible divide, the thing that stops service world and management world from understanding each other, is a thing we call performance information. This is based on, I think it's Conway's law. I could get my laws wrong. Maybe it's not Conway's law, but there is a cast iron law that as soon as you treat any performance data, any management data, as something which is subject to punishment or reward, it ceases to be in any sense useful as an actual measure of what it purports to measure. As soon as you pay people based on performance, they have three choices. They can either improve performance, which is difficult and uncertain, or they can just fiddle the figures, which is straightforward and likely to get good results, but immediately means you're looking at the wrong figures. And I'm reminded of the story about Alan Mullally when he started at Ford. Everything was going wrong. Doors were falling off cars because they were being manufactured to the wrong specifications. They were in free fall and losing billions around the world. He went into his first management meeting. Every dashboard was green. Why is that? It's because the culture was based on incentivizing managers to pretend they succeeded. But the answer is not to force them not to pretend, I'm afraid. The third option they have, by the way, is to hit the target but miss the point. Achieve the sales, but only by pushing them onto dealers or by other very, very short-term things which will get them their results and allow them to move on at a higher salary to another company, but will ultimately kill your company in the long term. So performance information is a real barrier to communication. Final world we've got is what I call the world of the board. In political world, it's politicians. I don't yet know what to call the boundary between management world and board world. Probably it's another form of performance information or reporting in. And I'm just now going to reveal the text that just narrates what I've just been describing on this slide. But board world operates in politics on popularity and votes. This is the second currency in political organizations. In for-profit organizations, I should say, board world operates in a slightly different way to management world. So our job in trying to achieve operational excellence, particularly in tough times when these worlds grow ever more apart, is to try to find a way to unite and communicate across all of these worlds. And hopefully the tools that I'm going to show you for the rest of this session will demonstrate some ways to do this. So I'm going to move on through each of the worlds and give you some of our core tools and some of our core thinking for applying systems thinking in tough times. First of all, we're going to dive into customer world. We have a definition for service, but I think most of this applies to production as well, that a service always co-creates value with and for the customer. No service and no product delivers value in its own right. It's only with the active engagement of the customer, the citizen, the end user, that it actually creates the value. If you start to pay attention to that, you start to realize that your only measure is that of customer value in the long term, and that our job is to reduce the effort, time, cost, steps, process, all the crap, sorry for swearing again if anybody's offended, between the customer need arising and us delivering the positive outcome. I'm reminded of Taiichi Ono saying the entire point of the Toyota production system was, I think it was, to minimize the time between order raised and cash received for finished goods. So this has a lot of implications. One is that you can move up the value stream, particularly in tough times, from just dealing with demand to supporting purpose. I'll go into that in a minute. But the other is, if you can actually shift your focus to really helping the customer achieve their own goals, in a sense, taking the middleman, it's partly yourself, out of the picture, but clearly maintaining the value capture mechanism, then you can actually really innovate, particularly in tough times when customers are more focused on the real value, and outthink your competitors. So those of you who are familiar with jobs to be done, which is another methodology I highly recommend you have a look at, will recognize some of this. The concept there is that people buying products not for the product, but for the job it allows them to do. So the classic example is a power drill. A power drill is used, I think, on average in its lifetime for something like 11 minutes, maybe less. Unless you're a very, very dedicated DIYer or a professional, you don't use your power drill much. But the point is, nobody buys a power drill to own a power drill. Well, some of us men do in a very sad kind of psychological way. What they're buying it for is for a hole in the wall. But when you stop and think about it, that's a great story, and it's true. They buy the drill to make the hole in the wall. Nobody in their right mind wants a hole in their wall. Why do they want the hole in the wall? Well, to put up shelves. Great. So what they actually want, the actual value they want, is to put up the shelf. Well, is it really? Actually, it's probably to have a less cluttered house, to have a sense of progress and achievement in their life. You see how you can move up the value chain in that kind of way. So I'm going to give you one example, and this is core to our thinking, is that most of the time in business we're processing demand. We're dealing with orders and we're trying to fulfill them. And goodness knows that's hard enough. And if you could just, as I said, listen to the customer demand and really fulfill it, you'll be doing better than most organizations. However, behind the demand is in tough times, we move to controlling the demand. We try to deal with only the high value demand. We try to reduce the complexity of the demand so we can reduce our costs. We try and simplify. And that's fundamentally unrewarding. It might work in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term. Behind every piece of demand is some kind of customer need, an actual requirement that somebody has in their life or their organization that they're trying to meet. That's more rewarding, but if we get into meeting their needs, there's the shadow side of codependency. We see a lot of this in our work in social care and health, but we see it in organizations as well, where organizations are locked together. And this can be profitable in the short term to constantly meet needs of an organization, but what's much more rewarding and much more profitable is behind the need is an organizational or a personal purpose. And if we can actually help people to achieve their purpose, then we're doing much better in life and as an organization. So, demand is for hotel rooms. The need is for somewhere to sleep for the night. The purpose is to have an interesting and fulfilling holiday and experience of the world. Quite different. So that's half of what I'm going to show you in customer world. And the second bit is equally critical, I would say. So that's to make a really clear distinction between two types of customer service proposition. And this works by analogy in manufacturing, but it's obviously designed to focus on services as I've set it out here. Here, the point is that there are two fundamentally different types of services that we can provide to our customers. One type is what we call standardized transactional services. This is where you want to pay a bill, you want to renew your license, you want to do something that's very transactional, maybe send something through the post. What you want there is a reliable service where you know what you get, where the expectations are absolutely clear and absolutely met, but you don't care if that's completely bespoke. A very standard, transactional, straightforward quality will do fine as long as it doesn't take up too much of your time. So customers for standardized type services are optimizing for minimal disruption. So what we want to do in organization is we want to have an operational, a low cost, a common process, a standard output, a mass production kind of model. The other type of service is customization, or we sometimes say customer intimacy. And this is where it's much more important to the customer that their individual or their group needs are really, really understood in detail, that you have the specialist expert knowledge to meet their needs. Your organizational focus there is quite different. It's about having to use a phrase that Ivo Velichkov coined, requisite inefficiency. You need to have enough slack in the system that you can get with your customers. You can partner them. You can create the best solution. This is a project, not a process. The outputs will vary from time to time. Why is this distinction so important, especially in tough times? Because if you get it wrong either way, you will disappoint your customers. Your customers won't stay around for long. Let me give you two examples. The first was when we did some work for a private bank. And the bank had a standard telephone IVR, dial the numbers for the different menus, type in your PIN number and your account number, get your details, etc., etc. They decided that for their high net worth individuals with a value, I think, holdings of over $3 million or something like that, they wanted to implement telephone recognition, advanced security protocols, voice recognition, so that when I dial up, as I'm not yet, but I hope to be a high-value customer one day, instead of getting through to that, press 1 for transactions, type in your code, and etc., I would get a concierge. I'd get somebody, a very pleasantly spoken young man or woman, who would say, "Hello, Mr. Taylor, how can I help you today?" So they implemented this, fully expecting that their rich, important individuals would really value it. And guess what? They absolutely hated it. Why? Because they knew all of their codes. They knew their PIN numbers, they knew their account numbers and their sort codes, etc. All they wanted to do was dial dial a number, input 30 numbers themselves, and listen to their balance or confirm that a transaction had just gone through. They wanted a computer that gave them a standardized, reliable, straightforward response. They did not want to speak to a person, however accommodating that person was. To put it the other way around, we had an attendee at one of our training sessions who had adopted a young woman, and that young woman was somewhat troubled and had run away. She was in her late teens, so it was something of a crisis, but not, immediately life and death, but very, very upsetting for the family. So this woman went along to her local police station, hoping to meet a kind of chubby desk sergeant, be sat down, given a cup of tea, listened to, understood, and told how these things normally go, and be reassured that it would all work. She went into her local police station, this is in the UK, waited for somebody to come to the desk, and eventually somebody wandered along in the background, behind the plexiglass screen, and pointed in an agitated way to behind her. Turning, she saw a phone on the wall which said, "Lift here to speak to the single non-emergency hotline." So she was being directed to a standardized service, which was a very transactional thing that just took the details, made the missing person report, didn't give her any of that emotional warmth and connection when she really needed that customized customer intimacy service. Getting that wrong either way will get you into trouble. We're moving now into service world, and I'm going to give you one core model that we use in service world to think about operational excellence, particularly in tough times. So that's the 7 ways to save and improve model. So again, this is service focused, but it applies to manufacturing also. We have a very simple model of the organization for this purpose, which is to say that all activities are triggered by demand, need, or purpose. We need to know about something that's happening out there in the world that we can sell to, that people have the requirements. We don't know about them unless they hit a contact point or trigger response. That might be calling our office and making an order, or it might be us going out and drumming up the business or inspecting a road to understand that there are potholes that need fixing, etc., etc. Every requirement uses a process or a project to deliver the results. They require the use of organizational, maybe partnership, maybe community assets. Those assets are mostly people, which are structured in organizations and wider partnerships. And all of the assets have to be procured or sourced from somewhere. And how we respond to demand or need is determined by our policy approach. So using this very straightforward organizational model, we say that there are 7 and only 7 ways to save and improve in services. Number 1, you can shape the demand. You can get upstream and actually help people to meet their own needs earlier on in the process, or help them to come to your channels, make sure they come to you instead of your competitors, etc., etc. Number 2 is a bit of jargon, I'm afraid, from 1950. So I think, I'm not sure who wrote it, but there's a great book called Flow Manufacturing, I think it's called. Don't quote me on that. What we mean by flow is having the capacity and the capability to meet customer demand at the point of contact in the organization. That's very straightforward, very simple in a sense, but it's what many organizations think is all of operational excellence. And I can understand why, because if you only have the capability and the capacity to meet need where it comes in at the right time, then you've solved an awful lot of problems. And this tends to be one and done. It may be single cell, multi-skilled manufacturing or shop teams who are able to meet customer requirements appropriately. But it means that we don't have to ping the customer demand around inside our organization, creating management complexity before it gets met. If you do it right first time, it costs less in every single sense. Good old waste reduction in processes and projects, another way to save and improve. And I often go to clients and they say, Benjamin, we've done lean, we've done agile, we've done TQM, we've done just in time, we've done DevOps. What have you got next? Give us a new fad, give us a new thing. And to be honest, if you just stepped outside their office door and did very basic process improvement of the most mundane kind, you could probably strip out 40 to 60% of their costs. So never overlook good old-fashioned waste reduction and process improvement. Then there's optimizing the use of resources, sweat the assets, make the most of what you got. My favorite example of this is we worked with a city council that had something like 7 fleets of vehicles, one of them doing library book stock recirculation, one of them doing internal mail, one of them doing Meals on Wheels to old people, another one taking old people to daycare, another one taking children with special educational needs to their schools and their settings, etc., etc., etc. And they managed not quite to reduce those 7 fleets down to 1 fleet, but to have 1.6 multifunctional vehicles, 1.6 as many as 7, multifunctional vehicles, which could do all of those things at different times of day and actually reduce their costs really significantly. Then there's effective organization, which does cover a multitude of sins, and we'll come on to that in management and leadership in some greater depth. But you can organize things more effectively, get economies of scale, bring things together, etc. Then there's optimizing procurement, get some extra value outside of your procurement, go for scale, go for volume, negotiate harder, etc., etc. And finally, you can change your strategy. You can change the way you address the market. And if I just present that now as a list with a little bit more information here about ways that you can address each of these 7 ways to save and improve, this does at least a couple of things for us. Number 1 is it gives us a fairly holistic way to look at all the opportunities to save and improve in organizations. And that's really valuable because you're not just coming in from one point of view. It's all about optimizing use of resources, or it's all about this or that. You're actually being able to take a rounded view. The second, though, and this is particularly important in turbulent or difficult times, and I'm just going to try and do my annotations again, is that there is a kind of upstream and downstream pattern here. So upstream, particularly shape and manage demand and create economies of flow, those two are more emergent more complex in the true sense of the word complexity, less predictable, and harder to do in many ways. Why? Because they require you to actually engage with your market, with your customers. They require the active response of your market and your customers to respond differently to your newly reshaped organization. They don't take the demand and the customer requirements as a given, but they seek to actually shape them. But for that very reason, they are more transformational. Because if you make the savings, if you make the transformational improvements up here at levels 1 and 2, then the savings flow all the way down through the cost base. Because, if you're shaping and managing demand, you've got more demand of the type you want. So you've got less demand of the type you don't want. If you're creating economies of flow, you're getting it in the right place, you're getting it done first time, etc., etc. However, the pressure in tough times is to push you down into effective organization, optimizing procurement, maybe optimizing the use of resources as well, which are more programmatic, more predictable. If you get the big four consultancies in, they can pretty much go through your contracts and look for gold plating and all the rest of it, and save you 7 to 12%. They are risky, particularly in tough times, though. You need them to deliver the short-term savings and capacity, but the problem with them is that if you do too much of them without thinking about your market, without thinking about cities and world, without engaging more widely, you will actually lock in your ability to do things differently. You'll stop yourself from doing things differently. So just to give you one example, that organization which reduced 7 fleets of vehicles to 1.6 fleets, we came up with some ways of optimizing some processes in their organization which involved the use of their vehicles. But because they'd saved massively by reducing it to 1.6 fleets, and then they'd done a 7-year outsourcing deal to a logistics provider, it would have cost them more to make the improvements and changes that we recommended, which were more transformational, shaping and managing demand, etc., because they would have had to pay such high penalty fees to their logistics provider. So if you do optimize use of resources, effective organization, optimize procurements, then you are locking in assumptions about the demand staying the same, which in troubled times are, first of all, dangerous, and secondly, reduce your strategic ability to innovate and to actually get upstream and meet your customer needs better. Going to move on now into management and leadership world. We've got management and leadership world, and then the world of change and learning to go. The important point I want to make, I'll just go through this very quickly, is that in most organizations, we're dealing with relationships conceived as a hierarchy. Those are very often destructive. They are power-based. They are command and control in the worst sense of those words. So we tend to think that networking is better, having everybody flat, working in partnership and everything else like that. The problem is that we're still dealing in relationships conceived as a binary. One person relating to another. So this just fundamental point from Mant, an Australian writer, makes the point that if you have what we call ternary relationships, if you're relating to each other, but with a shared focus on your organizational purpose, on your strategy, on the goal you both serve, then you are likely to have much better and more productive relationships. Just take a sip of water there. And the important point actually is to make sure that you are really focusing on relationships. So if you take nothing away from this talk, just bear in mind that all of leadership and all of operational excellence is about the quality of relationships first and foremost. I illustrate the possibilities of management and leadership with this beautiful thing on the left, right? And this guy on the right is a bit of a hero, Daniel McCallum. The story is that in 1855, along the Erie Railroad around New York and the Lake Erie, there was the first ever fatal train accident. Lots of people had died in the construction of the train lines, but unfortunately they were mostly considered second-class citizens and they didn't count as much. So even though trains were only going 30 miles an hour, somebody died in a fatal accident. Daniel McCallum was tasked with creating an organization chart and a rule book. It's called something like the Supervisor's Manual. It's available online in PDF from the Library of Congress, and it really is the first ever organizational enterprise architecture in the broadest sense of that word. So from this story and this creation of the first modern organization chart, which is what this is, we have two stories about organization. On the one hand, people say, and they're absolutely right, that the entire purpose of the modern organization charts is to pin blame on the appropriate person. That if something goes wrong, again, in the future, we will know who was delinquent in their duties. That's the kind of wonderful 19th century phrase that he uses. So this story says that the organization chart is first and foremost about blame, command and control, about stopping people from using their human discretion, and it's what's more, it's mechanical. He was a switch engineer. He was actually a very talented Civil War and post-war engineer, was Daniel McCallum, and he drew this organization chart as a mechanical thing. This view of organization says that hierarchy in organization is about destroying the human spirit, reducing us to cogs in a machine. So that's one story that you can take from this. But there is a second story. And the second story I draw from the fact that this thing on the left actually looks like something organic. It looks like a tree or a bush or a flower or something. And actually right down here at the bottom, this is the board of directors, not at the top, but at the bottom of the organization. And they're almost like a root ball kind of nourishing the organization. I think that's great. Something to aspire to, at least. This story says that organizations are creative, positive things. And Daniel McCallum was dealing at that time in 1855 with the creation and expansion of the telegraph system. This meant that for the first time in world history, it was possible for head office, here, this is Daniel at the center, to interfere with the operations right down at the end of the branch lines in almost real time, minute by minute. So the second story about the possibility of organizations, which is also true, says that this beautiful organic thing was created to maximize discretion at the front line within boundaries, and that's consistent with organizational coherence as a whole. My scribbles are really terrible. I'm sorry about that. Maximize the flow of useful information back to the center so that long-term strategic decisions can be made, not minute-to-minute command and control and operationalizing. So, as operational excellence practitioners, we have at our command those two possibilities of our organizations. That organizations are souls for are jails for the human spirit, that they destroy creativity, that they undermine people, or that they are actually ways of expressing human discretion and creativity. And of course, both of those things are true, but I love the fact that both of these come from this original modern organization chart. What does that mean? It means that if we are to survive in tough times, organizations which can be heaven or can be hell on earth, we need to have the right balance of freedoms and constraints to allow people in the organization to use discretion. All right, all of that might sound a bit theoretical, but we have a really nice little set of rules here. This is from a book, I think it's called Distributed Leadership, by a guy called Professor Nick Oblensky. And his point is that the soft principles on the left, the freedoms, having an underlying purpose, trusting people's skill and will, some tolerance to ambiguity, and giving people full discretion about how they carry out their duties, depend on the hard principles, the constraints on the right. His version of this is clear individual objectives, as few rules as possible, unambiguous feedback, and clear boundaries for what people can do and can't do. And actually, the problem is that most people who believe in distributed leadership and better organizations and network structures just go completely wishy-washy. And there is nothing more disempowering to people in organizations, particularly in times of crisis, than not knowing what their boundaries are, not knowing where their freedom to act ends. Because if you give somebody freedom to act, but you don't tell them what their boundaries are, chances are that when they come back and give you the results of their work, you either think they've used too much discretion and leeway and you didn't expect them to go beyond the boundaries in that way, or they've been a bit unambitious, unimaginative, and quite disappointing in what they've produced. So it's really important to understand that you have to have both of those two things balanced out in organizations. And we've got a nice little survey from Nick's book that you can do to actually look at that balance. So we say that you need constraints in order for people to be free, which is a nice little koan or something. So I'm not going to talk to you much about these, but we have a set of tools that we introduce in organizations, which include decision-making discipline, a simple process which is for collaborative but not consensus decision making, where a leader sets out the context and purpose of a task, and you don't get to move up until the team has interrogated, tested, added in their knowledge, built their understanding into the whole team understanding. Then, if everybody's got the purpose, you move to critical questions and you frame a set of questions in the form how to achieve something and what if something happens. So outcomes you want and risks that you need to avoid. And when you have a set of critical questions that everybody's happy with, everybody understands, such that if you answered them, you would be able to achieve the purpose, only then do you move on to generate ideas, selecting ideas, and getting to very crisp and clear task assignment. And the point about this in complexity, in tough times, is that as soon as you go out, what's the expression? No plan survives contact with the enemy, or as Tyson said, is it Tyson? Everybody has a plan until I hit them in the mouth, something like that. As soon as you go out in the world and realize something has changed or your context was wrong, you immediately bring everybody back down to step one, and you get there until you understand what you really know about the context now. And then you move to purpose. Has it changed? Move to critical questions. Do we need to adapt them? And move up. And it becomes much quicker. It becomes instinctive and a very strong decision-making approach, particularly when things are complex. A couple of other tools we use, people will have come across Seaport perhaps, which is that a task is not accepted as a task and can't be handed on to somebody else unless you tell them what the context is, what the purpose is, the outcome they need to achieve, what resources they've got to deliver it, and the time that they need to deliver. The point here is that having rigor and discipline creates a positive and flexible dynamic. Another thing that we get into doing is what we call role and process clarity. What you're trying to achieve is people having real ownership without being overwhelmed or blamed. So role process clarity means that you must understand your place in the structure, single sentence purpose for your role, the results, and most importantly, you have to negotiate and agree what authority you need from your manager and what authorities you need from and to your peers in order to be able to do your job. We take people through this. We have a little online tool where they can update it on an ongoing basis, but this is about the quality of relationships and conversations by getting clear about what your role actually is required to do. And you'll be surprised how many organizations just don't get this part right and people don't really know what their job is. And really importantly, as a leader in complex times, adapt to the circumstances. So we draw a distinction between technical problems, which can be solved by an expert with a program that are programmatic, that can be delivered in a straightforward way. They might be really, really complicated, scientific, technical, need a lot of working out and a huge brain, but they're fundamentally different from adaptive, wicked, complex, messy challenges where we don't really know the goal until we start to engage with the world, and we have to adapt, we have to take a systemic approach, we need to innovate. And if you've got any indicators of these on the right, if it's a recurring problem, if you can't resolve competing priorities, that's probably a hint that that's an adaptive challenge. If you as a leader, and this is from Adaptive Leadership by Heifetz and Linsky, don't meet the principal task of framing the challenges that you are facing in terms of which aspects of them are technical and which aspects are adaptive, then people will be trying to solve wicked, complex, messy problems with technical approaches, which will never succeed. You cannot have a program plan to solve childhood obesity or a program plan to engage with a completely emerging complex market. Or they might be using adaptive challenges to deal with technical problems, which also won't succeed and will be incredibly frustrating. So most business challenges have aspects of both. If you look at something like smart, mobile, flexible working, there's a technical side to it, getting all the technology right, doing the desk use analysis and the work style production and all of that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is also adaptive, social, complex. It's based on who gets what privileges, who sits near the printer, who sits near the boss. Where does the boss sit? Does the boss sit in the open office like everybody else? All of that kind of stuff. So that's a critical distinction to make. And that leads really into the world of learning and change, the final world that we'll address today, where we have a concept called change navigation. And we say that you've got on the right-hand side the complex, those wicked problems, on the left-hand side the tame, and at the top you've got change agents driven from the top, lots of power, and at the bottom, driven from the bottom, not much power. And what we find is that where change and transformation goes wrong, particularly in times of turbulence, is that initiatives that are seen as small and local actually are programmatic and have lots of interdependencies and need more central focus, and that initiatives that are seen as programmatic, that are trying to deal with cross-organizational issues, actually often require that transformational, complexity-inspired approach. So here's a little nice table that explains the differences between programmatic and adaptive change. The point is that if you try and deal with programmatic change using an adaptive approach or adaptive change using a programmatic approach, you're going to be sorry. So it's important to identify which you're attempting and what type of problem you're addressing. So all these slides will be circulated, so I'm going to whiz through just to get to the end here. We've done primary research on change in turbulent times. We looked at 12 case studies where over 40 jobs were lost or significantly changed. And we used this very nice colourful model. We basically went into each programme at the end and retrospectively mapped out every single change intervention that was done, whether it was a staff meeting or an email round or a job redesign or an evaluation panel, whatever it was. And we mapped every single change intervention into one of these boxes. But the only distinction that I need you to look at today is the distinction between the top left transformational change that's more emergent, that's based on meaning, that's based on resilience, people experiencing the change, and more bottom up, and the bottom right, which is the technical change, driven, top down, power based, control based, building knowledge and skills in the organization, etc. So we looked at examples within our set of 12 of success and failure. Actually, only 10 were valid subjects for the research. We bore out the old canard that 70% of change fails because only 3 programs actually succeeded. And those 3 big complex change programs in turbulent times that succeeded used 64%, about 2/3 transformational, bottom-up, emergent, experiential change, gave a lot of power to the people being changed, but still had 36% top-down. They had programs, they had budgets, they had sponsors, they had all of those kind of things in place. Of the ones that failed, the 7 that failed, they had roughly the opposite proportions, 30% transformational and 70% technical. And one which was a very guerrilla-inspired bottom-up movement and emergent was the biggest disaster of all. Didn't count because for our survey, because it crashed and burned very early on. The other one that didn't count for our survey was 95% top-down technical and didn't get anywhere either. So neither rollout nor revolution fits the case. You have to be able to get the right balance, which is probably more like 2/3 bottom-up, transformational, driven by the people themselves, and 1/3 technical, top-down, programmatic. This has led us to this approach to understanding transformation, which has served us very well, where we're moving from the classic change pyramid on the left, where you've got lots of telling people how things will be, and quite a bit of this consultation block, which is we'll consult you, but we'll make the final decision. What we actually do in transformational change in turbulent times is we put a lot of effort into reducing that consultation to a bare minimum, giving people all of the red lines and must-haves and must-nots and all of those kind of things quite clearly, but engaging much more full participation from the people in the organization. 2 more points to make in the world of learning and change. The first is that in turbulent times, waterfall change, step-by-step change fails, and it fails quite spectacularly. So our classic model is that we do plan, analyze, design, implement, monitor. But by the time you get to implement, lots of the world has changed. So your analysis and your planning is outdated. So your delivery slips. So waterfall fails before it's even started, particularly when times are turbulent and things are changing quickly. So now we move on and we overlap the analysis, the design, the implementation, and the monitoring, preferably with lots and lots of prototyping of iterative change, and preferably with lots and lots of cycles of learning between doing the prototype. So we do a lot of agile inspired change, where we are really delivering many incremental proof of concepts, prototypes, and then making normal of some of the changes, but not necessarily in a scaling up way, in rolling in people into the new way of working. So we're often creating a new team that works as a completely new process that can be stood up in just 2 weeks, for example, and then we refine that, knock the rough edges off it, and then we don't build the prototype of that and spread it across the rest of the organization. No, what we do is we bit by bit bring in new areas, new teams, new product lines into that new way of working until the old organization effectively withers on the vine and the new organization comes into play. If you do all of these things, you'll get away from the temptation to do more and more of what you're doing now, but do it slightly better. And you will move into a space of true learning. We take from Chris Argyris the concept of triple loop learning, but another great of organizational development makes the point that you actually never understand an organization until you start to try to change it. That's when you learn about it. So if you do things right, you will get into double and triple loop learning. The point is, if our identity, the way we see the world and our role in it, shapes our thinking, which shapes our actions, which shapes our results, most operational excellence change, especially in turbulent times, is only at the level of single loop learning. We took an action, we got a result. Was it the desired result? If so, make it standard. If not, how can we change it to act differently to helpfully get better results? Actually, you need to also be thinking about double loop learning. Can we reframe our understanding of the problem? Can we move up that customer value chain? Can we do more transformational, complex, emergent work to actually get a strategic advantage? And ultimately, you need to get into thinking about what is the triple loop learning? How are we changing our view of ourselves? This is why we say there's no learning without planning, because if you don't plan, you don't know what you expected to get, so you can't learn. But innovation requires changing the rules in some way. And of course, the classic now is that the biggest property company in the world is Airbnb, and it doesn't own any property. It just facilitates the experience of staying in property. The biggest taxi company in the world is Uber, allegedly, and it doesn't own any vehicles. It just is a platform, etc., etc. So those are examples of completely transforming. The example I prefer is a bit closer to home in public services where I often work, which is firefighters spent a lot of time doing single loop learning, getting better and better at fighting fires. Then some enterprising person said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we did some double loop learning? And started to think about how we can actually have fewer fires to fight, put ourselves in danger less. And over time, it's got to a point where the identity of firefighters as the macho people who put out fires has fairly completely changed in the UK. They still have to put out fires. It's still dangerous and people do still die, but fewer and fewer, thank goodness. The actual main role of firefighters these days is fire prevention. So you'll find them in old people's homes, going around and checking that the batteries in the fire sensor, fire alarm, haven't expired. So they've changed from this macho identity into a preventative, a completely different way of seeing their role in the world. And that's very, very easy to lose any focus on in tough times, but that's where the opportunities lie. So I've been through quite a lot. We've got a few minutes left if anybody wants to stick around for questions and answers. These are my contact details, and I'm happy to be contacted, and we'll make sure that the PDF of the slides is circulated. We offer 24-module online blended learning mini MBA type course. It's not really an MBA, but it's a bit like it, which helps people apply all of this kind of work, development work in all of these areas, and consultancy. But most of all, I want to say thank you for attending. Thank you to the Operational Excellence Society for giving me the opportunity to share this thinking with you. There's lots more where this comes from, so please feel free to follow up and ask questions now or afterwards. And thank you for Chuck for the technical assistance and to Joe Paris for setting this up. So if everybody's still there, I see there are some of you still there. I'm very happy to take questions now if you'd like to raise your hands and open any questions through the Q&A. Does anybody want to ask any questions? So Amal is asking how to change culture models during application if agile. Amal, I'm just going to allow you to talk. Can you expand on your point for just a minute? Oh, hang on. I'm unmuting. Am I unmuting you? I'm trying to unmute you. Can you hear me? Try and talk, Amal. Oh no, that's not working. I must have muted everybody. Well, I'll try and address your question directly. So we found that, in a sense, agile change is better at a particular type of culture change than programmatic change. And the principal way I would put this is that I do buy into the point of view that it is easier to act yourself into a new way of thinking than to think yourself into a new way of acting. That is, you can have all the indoctrination, training, and talking to that you like, but it's only when you actually start to experience and work in a new way that you'll really grasp it and really be able to act differently. And we see some really significant changes in the way people behave when we put them into prototypes and proof of concepts. Now, the big risk of that, and we've fallen foul of this several times, we've had a lot of failures, I must admit, over the years, is that you then isolate the rest of the organization, and you have to protect the prototype and the new way of doing things and only allow success stories to come out from that so that you get a positive understanding from the rest of the organization. But then other people can start to feel like second-class citizens. So it's important to have lots of show and tells, lots of go see, so other people can go and see and experience for themselves and see what it's like to be in that new way of doing things. But we found that that's a very effective way to change culture. What we try to do, Amal has pointed out that storytelling can help. I think that's absolutely right. I think it's really important how you tell stories. But the third aspect I would add, if the first aspect is creating the agile experience of doing things differently, second is how you tell the stories, that if leaders are really conscious of the culture change model that I haven't had time to share with you today, but of understanding and trying to start to be able to predict how people in their organization will respond emotionally to their behaviors as leaders, to the people systems of the organization, and to the use of symbolism in organization, which is very powerful. If leaders can start to predict that, it's a practice that you need to build over time. It's not straightforward. It's rather complex. It needs you to learn as a leader. But that can actually help to shape the culture really positively from the top down at the same time as people are experiencing some real bottom-up engaged change themselves. Hope that was a useful answer, Amal. Does anybody else want to ask any questions? Okay. Well, I'm very happy to follow up, and we will send around the recording and I think the slides in some appropriate format. So all that remains for me to say, and I'm going to switch my video on and have my silly headphones on again for you, is thank you very much for attending. I hope something in today has been useful. Please come back to me if you have any questions. Thanks all for your time. Goodbye.